All right. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for having me again, Platoon. It's always great to work with this group. So yeah, as Tom said, I've been doing this variations on this React talk for some time. I've been with TableXI now since 2014, and I primarily I'm a mobile developer, and that has continued to be the case. But I've dipped my toes a bit in front-end web development. And our mobile stack has gone from entirely native to pretty much entirely React native in the time that I've been at TableXI, which is, for those of you who don't know, is a mobile cross-platform framework based on React. Well, it uses React along with some other stuff that allows it to translate it instead of into web page. It translates it into native code. And there's enough overlap between those two that that kind of was my bridge back into front-end web development, which I hadn't really touched in a long time. And it has also worked the opposite way. At TableXI, we've had a couple people who started out doing web development, front-end stuff there, who were able to get involved in our mobile projects since the basic concepts of React are so similar between React Web and React Native. So it's been a really cool tool. So that was kind of how I got into React. And when I started giving this talk, it was still something of kind of a new kid on the block. It was not, it hadn't become kind of the standard that it is now, but it was clear there was a lot of momentum behind it, a lot of excitement among developers, and it was going to be a big thing. So partly I created this talk, not just as a way to introduce the concepts of React, because there's a lot of really good tutorials out there. The official documentation is quite good. I'm sure all of you you've already started learning it, right? You're a little bit into the process.
Yesterday was their first day, so they're still starting to sink in.
Yeah, usually that's when I do this workshop, so it's still pretty new, but at least you've got like the basics down. So I find it it's simple enough that it should be fairly easy to pick up. What I found was maybe not as clear, especially if you're new to web development. Like, why does React exist, and what exactly is the problems that it's trying to solve? Because I think that coming from web development, doing front end stuff before we even really called it that, using jQuery and even just using vanilla JavaScript before that, like, I've been around enough to understand how painful some of the simple things that React makes simple and easy. Like, I remember how painful it was to do those things manually. And so to me, it was very clear why React was a big deal. But I think that to people who are coming on board now, when React's now been pretty well established and it's all over the internet, and it's just kind of taken as read that React is worthwhile and something that you should learn. It's good to kind of dive into a bit of like, what exactly gave birth to React, and why does it make your life easier as a developer? So I hope I can help explain that, and that might make it a little easier for you to get a feel for using React when you're actually trying to build something with it. So this is meant to be a pretty interactive workshop. Hopefully you can follow along. It sounds like you've all got the basic setup. You've got Node and code editors and all that good stuff working. I'm happy to answer questions at any point during this. I figure this will probably go, usually this is about 2 hours of content. In terms of like what I'm going to show you. I'll try to throw some breaks in here, and I allow extra time, throughout for questions, any issues you might run into. Back when we did this in a physical room together, it was a little easier for me to walk around and kind of see like what people were working on, if people were struggling on certain things. So now I'm kind of, I'm hoping that people will speak up if they're having trouble. Sometimes if you're really like, banging your head against a problem, it can be hard to raise your hand and get help. But hopefully between this, me and the chat, we'll be able to get you off the ground if you're really stuck, because there's a lot of little snags you can hit right in the beginning that can be pretty frustrating. So I want to make sure that we cover all that stuff. Are there any questions before we start? Nope. Okay, cool. I'm going to share my screen. That's not helpful. All right, can everyone see the big blue title?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this talk is called React. What's the big deal? Like I said, what is the big deal with React? Why is it such a big thing? And there's a GitHub repo that follows along with this that has most of the code. I have to admit, I've not updated it in a very long time, so it's a little bit out of date. This whole presentation has evolved a bit over the years as React has changed slightly, but the gist is the same. So hopefully one of these days I'll put some updated code in there, but at least you can go back and refer to it. It does have some commit messages that can help you through some of the steps we're going to go through today. And it does include this deck as well, which is just Markdown. So, so first off, what is React? I mean, all of you are roughly familiar with it, but it's good to just get a definition out there. React is basically a JavaScript library for creating views, and it really isn't anything beyond that. This is a very simple, well, I won't say simple, there's quite a bit of complexity below the hood, but to you, the developer using this, this is just the way you are creating a view so that your user can interact with your site somehow. And beyond that, most of the complexity comes from the other tools you add and your own logic and the structure you build around whatever app you're making. Now, the question, again, I would like to try to answer with this presentation is, why is React special? You'll notice an asterisk next to the special, because special in this case doesn't actually mean unique. And this is even more true now than when I started giving this talk. Because some other similar libraries like Vue.js, for example, or Angular have kind of taken on some of the features or the approaches that React has been taking and have kind of gradually gotten a bit more similar to it over the years. So a lot of the stuff that you'll find in React, both in terms of what it can do and how you can approach working with it as a developer, they're not going to necessarily be unique to React, which is actually really good. This means that if you want to try to pick up another front-end framework, React is going to give you a really big leg up in learning those other ones. But the four things that I have identified that I think makes React what it is, and this is me subjectively outlining these, other people may disagree, but components, JSX, the diffing algorithm, and the ecosystem, the general React ecosystem, the community of developers. Components, this is a big part of how React is built and how it expects you to build apps. Essentially, you're going to be breaking up your UI, your whole, maybe you're building a very complicated web page, or maybe it's something very simple, but your whole front-end UI can be broken up into these small discrete pieces. And React makes it very easy for you to do this, and it makes it very easy for you to let these individual components just kind of focus on one single task. This is, of course, up to you. React is not very opinionated. It doesn't really make you do much at all. But the way the framework is built encourages this mode of thinking, and I think it leads to better code overall. So JSX, this is a big thing. I call it a Frankenstein's monster of HTML and JavaScript, but a good monster. It is an attempt to, this has always been the most challenging thing, I think, in front-end web development, is how exactly do you link up your markup, your HTML, the stuff that's just outlining what is visible on screen, with your JavaScript logic. And the old way of doing this was always pretty convoluted and brittle, and it was hard to work with. JSX is, I think, the best compromise I've seen, where it tries to seamlessly blend the two so that you can be thinking about markup and be thinking about logic in a way that makes sense, that doesn't clutter up your code too much, and can be easily debugged when it goes wrong. It's actually optional. JSX is not required. If you can see here, I have this comparison between JSX on the left side and just plain JavaScript React on the right side. These both are doing the same thing. This is the same functionality exactly. I'm not even sure if the stuff on the right actually is still valid. It probably isn't, but I don't care because I never ever do this. And when React first started, you had to use React that way. They didn't have JSX initially. But JSX is a way to just simplify everything, make it look like HTML with just a little bit of JavaScript kind of sprinkled in there in a nice, pleasant way that's easy to understand. The diffing algorithm. So this sounds complicated, and it is complicated, but the great thing is you don't have to worry about it. What I'm referring to here, I'm not even sure this is what React calls it, but what I'm referring to is how React automatically updates anytime data changes in the state of your app. Basically, the link between your data and the display assuming you've set up your display to properly link to, whatever data is going on. And that could be, stuff that's coming from your back end. It could be inputs that the user is putting into the site. Anything that's changing, the UI is set up to update automatically. It sees that something changed, it refreshes the page, and there's no thinking required on your part as a developer. And I cannot tell you how big of a deal that is. That, more than anything, this reactive pattern where the UI just reacts to, I'm pretty sure this is why they named it this, just reacts to the changes. That was always where all of your problems came from in the olden days. If you ever worked with jQuery or just plain JavaScript, and you tried to deal with the complexities of constantly changing data and making sure that you're updating your UI properly at the same time, that was a ton of extra work. It wasn't terribly rewarding, and it was incredibly easy to make mistakes and very hard to track down when problems were happening. So React largely eliminates this from your thought process completely. And that, I think, more than anything else, is why it's such a big deal. Oh, I don't have something for the ecosystem. Okay, I'm missing a slide here, but the next slide is the ecosystem. That is the other big deal. And this is kind of a sort of a virtuous cycle that React has seen. It got very popular because of the reasons I've just outlined. And as it got more popular, the community grew. There came to be more and more people working in the space, more and more third-party tools and libraries, which were increasingly good, well supported, well maintained. So if you're trying to build something that's a little bit complicated, there's a very good, if it's not something really unusual, there's a very good chance that this already exists in a well-maintained third-party library that you can just pull in and use. If you want to, say, chart something, if you want to handle displaying different kinds of dates and converting between different time formats and things like that. All of this stuff exists. That's actually, a lot of that stuff I mentioned isn't even React, but this is kind of JavaScript in general. But this is really key when you're developing, in open source space, which most of us are. The quality of the community and the work they're producing and how much help you can get when you have problems, how many tutorials you can find, how responsive devs are when there's an issue with their particular third-party package that you really need. All of that stuff is going to be a better experience when you have a thriving community that's using this stuff and that cares about it and depends on it. And that's the virtuous cycle with React. The more popular it got, the more this community was built up and the more helpful it became and the more reliable. Because again, this is open source. You're sort of depending on that enthusiasm of everybody to carry all this stuff forward, since so much of what you're getting is just free. And that, I think, is what really sets React apart and continues to. That's not to say that, again, Angular, Vue, these other libraries don't have their own communities and that you can't find that same support there, but they are smaller. You may have more trouble running if you run into certain kind of weird outlier problems. And that's something to consider as you're developing. So basically, the rest of React development, though, it really is up to you. Like I said, it's not very opinionated. I've referred to it as a framework, but I don't really think it is. It's more of a set of tools. It doesn't, it gives you ways to display data and ways to handle state changes, ways to handle all the, asynchronous calls and things like that. The various things you need in a web page, but it doesn't really expect or require you to do very much at all. It pretty much stays out of your way. It's just the view layer, essentially. So when you're building a more complicated app, you're going to be using other tools, most likely, in addition to React, to form the kind of backbone of what you're doing. Some of those are like Redux, for example. You might be hearing about that in the future. Redux is a really nice state management tool. You will most likely have some kind of a backend framework you're working with. It might be Rails, it might be something node-based, it might be Python. There's a lot of options there, and React is agnostic. You can, there are tools that will directly tie it into these backend frameworks, but there are also, you pretty much always have the option of just having React sitting by itself and just talking to an API, and that could be anything on the other end of the API. React doesn't care. You can build your own structure in React as well. Context, I don't see a lot of people working with this directly, but there are ways with context to sort of combine the different components of your whole app in a way that's hopefully clean and gives you a lot of options. Hooks, which are still relatively new in React, but allow you to very flexibly manage state changes and things like that. It's totally possible to build a whole functioning app in just React. You may not need any of this extra stuff at all because it does add a lot of complexity. But that's just to give you kind of an overview here of like how big you can make this if you want, but you do not have to. So with that said, let's just go ahead and dive into some code here. I am assuming here that you've created a fresh React project. If you haven't, you can just run create React app, which I'm guessing, is that what you're using?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So yeah, you can run npx create React app or whatever, get a fresh project loaded up. And then we're going to go into the terminal and we're going to run yarn start. You can also use npm start. I don't know if you talked about the difference between yarn and npm, but you might see both of them in a lot of tutorials and other documentation. Essentially, yarn is just kind of sitting on top of npm, and it gives it a bunch of features that npm originally lacked. npm has since added these features, so sometimes people will just kind of use one or the other. At this point, I just use yarn until it breaks, and if it breaks, I'll just switch back to npm. Bounce back and forth a couple times in between those when there were weird issues, although that hasn't happened in a while. Yarn has been pretty stable for a long time. So, but essentially, it's a tool that's gonna help you run npm scripts, and it's gonna keep track of your dependencies. You don't need to worry about it beyond that yet. So I'm gonna go ahead and open my terminal. Oh yeah, probably. Can everyone see? Is this text big enough for people to see?
Hey, Quinn, I had a question real quick. Did you want us to code along with you? I just want to double check and make sure if you wanted us to code along or just watch.
Yes. Yes, I want you to code along with me. I'm gonna stop periodically and be like, do this, and then give you a little time to work on your own.
Yeah, that's a big enough terminal. You can see it.
Cool. And same thing with my VS Code. Can you see that?
Yep.
Great. I actually have a pretty small monitor myself, so or how about that? Is that better? This is a little easier for me.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. Okay. So I've created an app I call Super Duper App, and I've actually messed with it a bit before this tutorial, so it might not exactly match yours, but it's pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and run yarn start. If you want to actually see what yarn start is doing, by the way, great. So that went ahead and opened up my browser automatically, and you're going to see probably a sample message. This is something I've already changed, but we'll get into that in a second. You should see something very similar to this little spinning nuclear symbol at the top, and some messages about React. The whole thing is filling your screen. It's all very nice. If you actually want to see what yarn start is doing, by the way, your package JSON, which is kind of your central, I guess it's kind of like the core of your app in many ways. It's your basic config file. It has a bunch of scripts here that are built in that React just hands to you. So what yarn start is doing is actually running these scripts. It's actually running a script which then calls React scripts and starts. So you're running a script that runs a script that's probably running a bunch of other scripts. This is just kind of the world that we live in as developers, where all of your tools sit on top of thousands of other tools. And at some point you just kind of lose track of what's actually happening and hope it's all working. So essentially that's about as much as you need to know about that. But the cool thing is you can add your own scripts here too, as you get a little, if you start doing stuff that you really want to automate, that's getting to be a pain to do, you can add those into your package JSON as well. But we're not going to worry about that yet. Let's just focus on the actual app itself. So if we go into here, so this here, if you are familiar at all with, with your basic setup of web development, this is going to look pretty familiar. You have an index file that is kind of your main file. It's a JS file. It's not an HTML file. The HTML is all getting created by React. So you don't actually worry about that. You are going to live here in JavaScript land, essentially creating JSX, which is then going to be rendered out to HTML. So what actually shows up in your browser is not exactly this. It's close enough that you would probably recognize it if you went and looked at your source. But generally, you are going to be dealing with this, and React is going to be handling that translation into standard HTML, CSS, all that stuff. So, so hopefully everyone has that running. If you have any issues, maybe drop a note in the chat. I actually can't see the chat. Sorry.
How did you do that so fast? Because it usually takes me about, I don't know, somewhere in like 5 to 10 minutes to start a project.
To start it from, you mean to create it or to start it?
I guess create would be the right word then.
Oh, I already created it. That's why.
Okay.
That was not the whole process. Yeah, if I had run create React app now, it would have taken at least a few minutes because it has to pull down. I mean, a fresh React install is like 30,000 files or something. It's a lot. So that's not, yeah, especially if you don't have a fast connection, that can be a little bit slow. Yeah, just for expediency, I already created the app and I'm just starting it. Starting it should be instantaneous. That should not take very much time. If it is, then something might be a little wonky with your setup, but.
Hey, Quinn, for Yarn Start, was that
Mhm.
another package that you had to install on top of this, or did that natively just work for you?
You do need Yarn. Yeah, how do you install Yarn? I think you can install it through npm. Let me actually check. I believe that, no, not that kind of Yarn. I believe that hopefully you should all have npm installed. If you're running create React app, you have npm installed. You probably also want to have something like nvm, which is a node version manager as well. That's a really good thing to have. Once you have that stuff, you can install pretty much everything else. I believe Yarn has no, here we go. If you don't have Yarn, you probably want to grab it. Yeah, okay, this is how you do it. You just install it as an npm package. So it is actually just another dependency. And you can run this command npm install -- global, or you can also do -g yarn, and that will make it available for your whole machine regardless. Global installs are kind of I don't know if it's worth going into that now, but npm is a package manager. Most software that you're going to be dealing with is going to have some version of this. It's like Ruby gems, or I think, what is it, pip in Python? Is that the package manager? Like, they all have something like this. Generally, you're going to either be installing stuff kind of globally so your whole system can use it and you as a developer can use it from the terminal or wherever, or you're going to have specific dependencies for your project. Where right now in our project here, you're going to be worried only about the stuff really that you have locally installed, which again is all in your package JSON. This is just a list of everything that you're depending on right here. And there's very little here now because this is just a fresh install. React itself has a ton of dependencies that you don't see. So there's way more going on here. Again, that's the 30,000 files that you're installing when you start this. But you only need to worry about like this stuff right here. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And again, I'm not going to get into like, adding third-party stuff or how you integrate things like that, but it's usually pretty simple, and it will involve using Yarn or npm to install the package. And then you just pull it into your code and follow whatever instructions it has. Any other questions?
I'm just curious, is there a way to cache all that? Like, I mean, 30,000 files every time you start a React?
It is cached, yeah. Your node modules folder here is where all that stuff is installed. You generally will be ignoring this in your source control, so you're not like committing it. You just commit the packages you need with the expectation they'll be downloaded later. And yeah, when you run yarn install, it's only going to install anything that's changed. So actually, if I do that right now, I can stop this right now and I just run yarn. If you just run yarn, that's the equivalent of yarn install. It's going to look at my package JSON. It's going to see these dependencies. You can also add dev dependencies, which you might see sometimes, stuff that you only need when you're developing. It's going to look at these and it's going to install them if they're not installed, but it's going to check my node modules folder to see if they're installed first. And since they are, yeah, in 0.62 seconds, it realized I don't need anything done and I'm good. So yeah, it will only deal with changes. That said, every now and then you might get some weird issue where something is being cached that you don't want cached, and you occasionally will have to just blow away your whole node modules folder and your caches and reinstall everything from scratch. But it's usually pretty quick. I know 30,000 files sounds like a lot, but these are small. These are text files. They're not massive. So
Does it matter where your node modules is relative to your directory?
yes.
Okay.
Well, that's kind of funny. Yarn and npm try to help you out, and sometimes they are a little too eager. So they will sort of look around like folders nearby for no, like they'll actually go up, I think, if there's no node modules in the current folder or something. What ends up happening a lot probably is you will be in the wrong directory and you will run a yarn install and it will just install a bunch of nothing. Like it will put a node modules folder there, be like, okay, cool, you don't have any dependencies, but I'm going to put node modules right there. And I you know, I can tell you with some embarrassment how much time I've sometimes wasted wondering why something wasn't working when I was just in the wrong directory and, you know, was talking to basically an empty node modules folder instead of the actual project I was doing. So watch out for that. It will, this is kind of a JavaScript thing. JavaScript often fails silently, or it just tries to keep things working. It's like it's trying to paper over everything and make it look like everything's okay. And that can sometimes lead to you not noticing certain issues. This is something that happens a lot in JavaScript development. So we have a lot of tools like Typescript, for example, that we've created largely to make it easier to tell when you've made a mistake. But yeah, so you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to move the node modules folder anywhere. It's already in your directory and you want to just keep it there.
Mine ended up installed Parrot like at the same level as the whole directory, not inside of it. That's what I'm kind of trying to figure out. What's the correct?
Oh, then you need to go into, that's because you ran yarn install outside the directory. And it just went ahead and was like, okay, you've got nothing to install, but I'm going to install nothing. And it didn't tell you anything. It didn't give you an error. It just did it. Yeah, very, very common mistake. So, so you can delete that. No, you can always delete no modules if you want. It's, you know, it's considered expendable because it can always be reinstalled. So you can go ahead and delete that and then just go into the directory and then run yarn install from there. All right, so so yeah, let's play around a little bit. I want to talk about that, the Diff engine. This is actually there's sort of two different Diff engines going on here. To be frank, we're going to edit the text in a text editor, and it's going to change automatically. This, I probably shouldn't even have called this the Diff engine, because this is actually something called a tool called Watchman that is running while your server is running, while your React app is up and running. It's checking all the files you have to see if any of them change. If they change, it then automatically reloads the page, which is really great. So you can generally be confident that whatever's on the screen is up to date with all of your latest file changes, which is another thing that you used to have to do manually that was easy to screw up. This is not the same thing as the diffing algorithm I was talking about before, where the state of your app changes and that updates things. We're going to see that in action in a little bit. But again, you don't have to worry about any of this. This is not stuff you control. This is just part of the React experience and what they're trying to make your development flow like. Just cutting out all these little stops and starts that you used to have to do, so you can just work essentially and create what you need to create. So with that said, let's go into app.js. This is our main component. I mentioned components earlier. The app itself is a component, and anything that you put on screen within this is a subcomponent of that component. It's kind of like this branching tree. So this is the only component we have currently, and it's the only one we need to change. So I went ahead and changed this from their default message to hello from React. I'm going to change this again. When I save that, I jump back over to my browser and it's already changed. So if you try the same thing, you should see the same deal. Whatever you change this text to should just appear. Every now and then, something will get a little stuck or it won't quite work, and you might need to physically reload. But for the most part, you shouldn't have to even think about this. You can just edit your files and just keep moving along.
Is there a way to get the browser to update without having to save the file or click on the browser?
I'm not sure. What would it be updating to? If you haven't saved the file, then as far as the browser is concerned, nothing has changed.
Yeah, that sounds like common sense now. So thanks.
No. I mean, if your app is like doing stuff, if it's running anything in real time, then it will be updating the whole time. It will continue to do that even if you don't have it focused. So that's something to consider if you if you're working on something and you don't want it to be updating, that might be something you keep in mind. But yeah, generally it will, yeah, the display will change because either the state of your app changed or your files changed. And when your files change, of course, the app kind of reload, the whole page refreshes. So it may kick you back to an earlier point. It should keep you wherever you were in the app if you're like, you have different screens and stuff like that. It does its best to kind of do a smart reload. So it tries to keep you where you're at instead of just kicking you back to like some sort of intro screen or something like that. But yeah, that's generally when you're going to see those reloads happen. Also, I can't see the chat super easily, just so everyone knows. I know there's some people having some problems in there. So if anyone wants to like just shout out if there's a particular issue they can't figure out, just let me know. So, so next up, let's edit the style. The style in React is not really a React thing. Like React doesn't really change the way you approach styling in a website. It's all using CSS, just the same way any normal browser, any normal web front end would. The only difference is that you're going to see the use of class name instead of class. If you're familiar with CSS classes and IDs, you'll note that this looks like a normal kind of situation where you would give something a CSS class and it's going to style it based on that class. You have to say class name in React because since we're using JSX and JSX is JavaScript, class is actually a reserved word. You can create classes for your components. And in fact, that's what you used to do all the time. Increasingly, we've moved to functional components, and I'll talk a bit about the difference between those in a minute. So you don't see it as much, but you can't use the word class. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. If you open up app.css, you will see app link, which is exactly that class that's being used here. Oh yeah, actually these all have class names. So class name app header. All those are represented here in the CSS. And this is just normal CSS. This is not, there's nothing special about this. So it behaves exactly the same way it always would. So if we want to go ahead and like change the background color to, I don't know, something really gaudy, some magenta here, you'll see that creates this wonderful eyesore. Again, that just the same way as the changing the JS, Watchman noticed it, reloaded the page. Same thing happens when you change your styles. So when you change anything, it should always update here. I'm going to change that back though, because that's very hard to look at. We can change the minimum height here. And you can see all the extra page stuff that's below what this little header is showing. And all that stuff works.
Where are those units for minimum height, the VH?
I don't know. I've never used them personally. I think it's a percentage because 100 seems to fill the entire screen.
I think it stands for view height. So whatever the height of your view is, you're taking a
There you go.
percentage of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice. There's some stuff, honestly, I'm not a CSS guru, especially because I tend to work in mobile where React Native has its kind of own weird CSS-like structure that it does in pure JavaScript. So it can't do all of this stuff. So I don't even know I don't even know what this means, to be honest. Like this is some kind of like setting the text size based on the screen size, I guess. Yeah, if you want to learn about CSS, there are tons of resources about that, and they're not, again, not React specific. So React doesn't limit really anything you do in terms of styling. So now we're going to get into what React does do that is special. We're going to take that text that we just edited and replace it with a variable because we are in JSX, which means we're using JavaScript, and we can basically put any JavaScript in here we want. So everything is like this is a dynamic, language that's being executed right now. It's not like your standard HTML where you would just be seeing markup and it's not meant to change. So let's go ahead and take this value. I'm just going to take that out, and right here at the top of my app. So above this return block, the return block is important. This is where I give React what it's going to display. If I want to do anything, any kind of calculations, any sort of logic before that happens, I really want to do it above my return block. And everything that happens here is just pure JavaScript. It's not even React specific anymore. You can put any JavaScript logic in here you want. So in this case, I'm just going to create a variable. I'm going to do something very simple. We'll just call it text. And we can give it whatever value we want. And now back here where we had our text before in this paragraph tag here, the way I'm going to drop that in is I'm going to use curly braces. Curly braces inside of JSX are basically like, here's some JavaScript. Essentially, anything you put in here, it's going to evaluate the JavaScript, and whatever that JavaScript returns, it's going to put out onto the screen as a value. So in this case, I'm just putting text, evaluating that text variable in JavaScript just gives me back the value, which is this string right here. And now when I go back into the browser, I should see something like this. And again, everything in here, so this is just pure JavaScript. This is just pure JavaScript. So I can do stuff within here if I want. If I want to add some stuff to the ending, for example, I can do a little operation here. I'm adding on extra text, and then you'll see that appends my extra string just the same way it would anywhere else. So this is powerful and a little dangerous. You can put as much logic right here inside your markup as you want, and it won't try to stop you. So that can just be a way sometimes to quickly and easily change some stuff dynamically that you want to change. It can also be an opportunity to make your markup really complicated and unreadable. So again, React stays out of your way. It's up to you to make sure this stuff makes sense, both to you, any other developers you're working on, and to you a year from now when you come back to this project and don't remember any of it, which is a very important person to remember. That person is going to hate you if you don't make some decent decisions now. So is that everyone following that so far? Cool.
So, and
Great.
real quick, actually, so
Yep.
Yesterday there was the do not manually edit state and prop values. Is this kind of related to that at all? Like, is this just good practice or?
Yeah, we'll get into that shortly. Yes, state is like basically, yeah, how you want to update state, you do have to be thoughtful about. So right now we're not doing that. This is just, I'm creating this here, but this is a single flat value that is exactly the same every time the page renders. Oh, that's another thing that's important to remember. All this text, all of this code here will run every single time this component renders. The component will re-render anytime your data changes, for example. So if you have something that's like a clock ticking up or something like that, and that value changes, all of this is going to run again. So that's important to remember that this is something that you should expect to happen a lot. And there's ways, if you want something to only run once and never again, there's ways to do that. But the default behavior is that this just keeps running. So essentially what's happening is every single time this page loads, we are creating this text, we are giving it this value, and then we're just displaying it on screen. We're not actually changing state, and there's no props involved here. But we're going to get into that in a second. And yeah, the way you do that, since that affects how things do refresh and how the whole page behaves, there's certain ways you need to do that kind of stuff to avoid problems. But when I was talking about the danger of putting a lot of logic in here, that's more of a, like, that's not actually going to screw up the workings of your app. That's just the other kind of side of this. There's the whole, like, using the tool correctly, making sure you don't have problems. And then there's using the tool elegantly and in a way that makes sense so that you can communicate what you're doing. Because again, you always have at least one partner in coding anything, and that's you in the future. And that you in the future is probably not going to remember exactly why you made certain decisions. So you need to think about keeping your code sensical, so that it's not too hard for you to pick up and follow later. That's what I was talking about, but it's not going to affect the way React works. So
Thank you. Sorry, I realize now that we're not even dealing with states and props.
we're about to. So actually, that's a good segue.
Hi, Quinn. Sorry to interrupt. So,
Sure.
can I put a for loop inside of return?
Yes, you can put a for loop in there. So the thing to remember, well, it is possible to create infinite loops in return, which is what you want to avoid. Because again, so it depends what your for loop is doing. But if you're careful, then yeah, you can absolutely do that. For example, let's say we want to do something like this. Let's say we have a whole bunch of text values. This actually happens pretty frequently in a lot of different kinds of web pages you're going to build, right? You have a bunch of values. You have a list of names and email addresses or something, right? So instead of this being one value, let's make it an array. Another variable, and just put whatever in here. Let's just do like 3 of these. And now we have an array, right? So if I change nothing, actually, I don't even know what it's going to do. Let's find out. Okay, if I change nothing, it's just going to evaluate all of these in a row. But let's say I want each of these to be on their own line. I want them to, have a little bit of formatting or something like that, right? Like we're creating like a table kind of view here. I can create a for loop here. Actually, what I would probably do is I would use map, which is kind of like a for loop. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. It essentially runs through every element of an array, and it creates a new array with like new values that you change. But let's just do a for loop if that's what's more familiar to you, because it can do the same thing. So let's say,
Quinn, did you think of mapping it there so you didn't mutate the data instead of going with for each? Was that the rationale there?
Well, yeah, you generally don't want to mutate data if you can avoid it. But in this case, I was thinking of map because map is going to output something. For each is going to go through every single element and do something to it, but then you still just have the array sitting there. Map will go through and will actually spit out new stuff. So map is typically how you would do stuff like this. So you're spitting out some JSX basically. I'm creating a new array of JSX and I'm giving that to React to render. But yeah, I'm pretty sure you can do. Doesn't like my for loop though. Is it going to yell at me? Oh, okay, I'm just not finished yet. But let's say we'll do the standard old-fashioned loop. And I wonder if it actually will let me do this. Yeah, I do need to do map. I mean, I could do it up here too. That's the other thing. Like I could do the for loop here, create a new array. There's a lot of stuff I can do. I could create a new array and just put that array down here, for example, if I wanted to add a bunch of spaces.
Yeah, when I tried to put the for loop inside of return yesterday, this happened as well. So okay. I have to move it outside of return, and I don't know why.
Yeah, it might be trying to it might be doing some behavior that could cause infinite loops essentially, since I'm not 100% sure. And like I said, typically the way you would do this is with map, which is so let's just do it the way I would normally do it. I would just do this text map, right? So now it's going to loop through the whole array. Every time it loops through, I'm going to get the particular element of the array. So, and then I can do whatever I want with it. And it's going to output the result. So in this case, let's say I want to do, a new paragraph tag inside of here, which should automatically cause some new spaces to appear in between. There we go. And that's what I want. So typically that's how you would do it. Yeah. For loops, I don't use for loops a lot. Usually I do stuff like this where I'm either, I'm filtering or I'm mapping, or I'm doing something like that. There's a whole bunch of these convenience methods that JavaScript gives you that makes it very easy to go through loops and change them. And if there's something you don't want to do, there's a library called Lodash you might hear about, which gives you a ton of power to do really great stuff with arrays. So yeah, typically that's the way I would solve that problem. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Thank you.
Okay. Cool. So let's I'm just going to go back to our simpler version from before, make this interesting. Notice how this doesn't give me an error message. This is another little fun bit of JavaScript, right? I just turned this back into a string. It's not an array anymore, but I'm still mapping it. So what's this going to do? Okay, well, this actually crashes, but I didn't get any kind of a warning. And there are some instances where you might be able to do array-like behavior on a string. That's the thing about JavaScript, is it just kind of tries to do whatever you tell it to do, and it will do the closest thing to what you want to do, which isn't always what you want to do. So again, this is something to be aware of. JavaScript is nice and simple in many ways, but it has a lot of pitfalls like that because it's always just trying to move forward, regardless of whether what you're doing is making any sense at all. So, all right, so we're back to where we were before. I have a simple variable and I'm just displaying it. So now I want to talk about making new components. And this is what's going to be our segue into props and state.
Sorry to kind of, was text element in a situation is an arbitrary like placeholder?
Yep. It's the, yeah, I'm essentially saying, okay, loop through this whole array, and then every single time, and then I'm actually giving map a callback function. I'm saying, here is the function I want you to call every time you go through. Maybe draw this out really quick, but like what I was doing there was, you know, oops. Like another way to look at this, for example, is, so let's say I have an array, you know, it's just 1, 2, 3, okay. And I can have a function, so I can, I'm just gonna, a function can also be a constant. This is another JavaScript thing. But let's say I created that callback function as like as a separate function or as a constant. And this is like callback, right? And this is my little function here, which just says, adds an exclamation point. So here, now I have my array. That's just data. Here I have a callback function. This is a function that takes a single parameter and it adds an exclamation point to that. In this case, I'm assuming I'm getting a string here. Although if I get a number, it's still gonna, again, JavaScript is gonna just try to roll with it. So it doesn't know what this is. It just knows that it's gonna add an exclamation point to it. And when I map the array basically takes a callback function. So I can then use this. And I'm saying, okay, array, you know, I want this array to go through every one of its elements. And then for every one of its elements, I want you to call this function I'm giving you, at which point it will call the function. So this function, like any function, can name the parameters that are coming into it. So that's what text element was. I can call this anything I want. I can just call it A, you know, it doesn't matter. It's the function just knows I got something, I'm calling it A. An array, the map function doesn't know what the callback function does. It just knows that I gave it a function and it's going to go through every single one of these and it's going to call these. And at the end of that, I can put this right into my my stuff here, my JSX, to actually see the result. And you can see it went through every single one of those numbers and it saw a number. It saw that I was trying to add a string, you know, a string, the string being that single exclamation point to it, and decided, okay, I'm just going to treat this number as a string and give you the string value of the number, and I'm going to add that exclamation point on. I'm going to give you back this string. And that's one of the things that's a decision JavaScript just made for us because it was pretty sure that's what we wanted, and that's the kind of stuff JavaScript does. Does that make sense? Cool. Great. So let's make ourselves a new component. So this is a way I want to start getting into a bit of how the different components talk to each other. Like, again, our whole app is one single component. But that component can be made up of as many subcomponents as we want. Each one of those components can have its own components, and so on and so forth. That might sound a little overwhelming right now, but this is actually a really great way for you to just organize all your code in places where it makes sense and keep it small and discrete. So in this case, let's say we have a big header title, for example. We'll add one here at the top. Right above our image, I'm going to add an H1 tag. I'm going to say title. Oops. And then I'm going to look at what that looks like. Okay, so let's say let's decide, okay, this here and this animation, this is a header. We want this on multiple pages, and we kind of want it to do its own thing. It's going to have its own functionality. It's independent of the rest of the content of the page. So we're going to move this into its own component. And this is our decision as developers, where you put components, what goes into what component, all up to you. React does not care. React will just do whatever you want. So the structure is up to you. So in this case, we've reviewed this page and we think it makes the most sense for this to have a separate header. So I'm going to create a header up here. And I'm going to follow the exact same pattern here that app is following. In this case, I'm putting everything in the same file. You can also put them in separate files and import them, which you probably will end up doing. But that's another thing React doesn't care about. As long as it knows that this exists, if you've imported it or you've declared it here, React will just put it in and will not ask any questions. So we're going to pull out. I'm actually going to call this title, not header, because otherwise it might be confusing. We already have an actual header tag, which is an HTML tag, but there's no title tag that I'm aware of. So we're going to pull this out into title. So remove that. We're going to put a return block in here, because again, anything that we want to show, we have to actually return. And then immediately this starts yelling at me. This will hopefully is yelling at you too. I'm using VS Code and it has a bunch of built-in checks to make sure that I'm doing JavaScript correctly. If you're just using a plain text editor though, you might be a little bit more in the dark about what's going on. But this is actually causing a problem here. I've just taken two elements and placed them side by side. I'm trying to return that. JSX doesn't let you do that. So we need to place these two inside of some kind of parent element. If we don't want to do anything with that element, if we don't care about its formatting or anything like that, we can use what's called a fragment. And we can actually use an empty angle bracket tag like that. And as long as that covers everything, then the error will go away. So you can see the angry red text is gone. And now it's fine. I'm not entirely sure why React can't just figure that out on its own and just put a fragment around it if you don't give it one, but it can.
So as far as that, would it process it the same as a div tag in HTML, or how does it process that?
I'm not even sure. I'm not sure. That's a good question. It might just be a div tag with no styling. Let's find out. Actually, well, first we have to show it. Okay, you'll notice that it disappeared. I added this JSX. It's still there, but currently nothing is using this. I've now pulled it out of app. App is the only component that's being shown on screen. And app is not showing our title component. And you can actually see my editor underlines it in yellow and says, hey, this is never being used, which is a nice clue that like, okay, this is just unused code right now. So when we want to put it back in, I'm going to go back to where it was in my code before. I just put in title like this. And I treat it just like a normal HTML tag. And that's how all your components are going to work in JSX. Generally, the convention is to capitalize them so you can tell the difference between your custom components and the lowercase stuff that's just built into HTML. But you don't actually have to do that, I don't think. So now we go back to the browser, everything is back.
Quinn, just a follow up on that. I think, yeah, I came across this. I think components have to be capitalized.
Does it?
I think so, yeah.
Let's find out. Oh, you're right. Interesting. And notice how it didn't give me an error either. It just didn't show it. Let's check and see. Let's check our developer tools. These are a good thing to get used to. If you're not familiar with them yet, I'm using Safari, but Chrome has a really good built-in stuff. Firefox does as well. Yeah, no error. Look at that. It just tried to treat that as an HTML tag that doesn't exist. So I'm actually curious what it's even spitting out here. Is it actually showing that? I'm going to look at the resulting code here. Yep. Okay. So it does do that, but the browser doesn't know what that is, so it just ignores it. Very interesting. Oh, good to know. So yeah, so you have to, so know that you have to capitalize these and it won't warn you if you don't do it. Very important stuff. So I've recapitalized it. It's shown up again. Let's see what it actually did do. It looks like it did not. It did not put anything around it. So it's, yeah, it's actually, it is pure, that fragment is just a thing to tell JSX that these things belong together. That's a very weird little feature. Anyway, but it's nice because then you don't, yeah, there's no styling going on at all. If they still are treated, I think, as children of that top level HTML, whatever HTML component contains them. So if you're doing any kind of styling that depends on iterating through children, which is a bit more complicated and I don't know a ton about, but they would still behave that way. So that's good to know. So anyway, but now we have our separate component and we've placed it inside here and everything is working as before. Basically, this is the exact same thing as before. We have simply pulled out the JSX and placed it somewhere else. We haven't changed anything else. So this is behaving exactly the same as it did before. So you can use this purely organizationally like this. This is a great way, you know, if you have a really complicated app, it's a lot nicer to have something that looks like this, where it's just like, you know, your top level container, and that contains like a title, and here, you know, and then like, here's a body, you know, that sort of thing. If you have enough complexity, something like this can be a lot easier to read and a lot easier to understand. So you can then move all of your complicated functionality and anything else like that down into the lower levels of these smaller components and not have it mucking up your whole, you know, layout. But that is not going to change the way things behave. Again, this is all about how much sense does your code make and how easy it is to follow and how easy is it to maintain and update. Now, the question is, of course, how do we get these two components to actually talk to each other, right? In this case, this component, all it does is return JSX. It just shows a thing. But let's say we want it to interact more in a more complex way with our app. So we're going to go ahead and try this out. We're going to pass that variable that we created, the text variable, into the component as a prompt. So here we're getting on props and state. This is a really key thing in React. The two ways that React handles data that is particular to components, right? So we've seen data, right? We created a variable. So you can use just sort of free floating JavaScript data if you want. But if you want to start getting more structured about it, and you want it to start adapting to the ways that your components work and the way they change, that's when you need to start getting into props and state. So we're going to start off with props. Props is short for properties, and their external values you pass into the component from another place. Essentially, they don't change. They actually can't change. If you try to change them, it'll yell at you. They are meant to just be something that's passed down from above. So in this case, our header, or our title rather, our title component has a title and a logo. Let's say we want this title to be dynamic, right? Let's say we have a name of our user or something like that. So our user, you know, we'll do this as a placeholder for now, but let's say we have a dynamic, you know, value for the user's name based on the person who actually logged in. And we want to show that up at the top. We can actually just remove the text from here instead of title. So how do we get this value into title? Well, first, title needs to accept a prop. We need to have it, it's a function. Like any JavaScript function, it can take in certain values. And since it's a function, like, so it looks here like we just created our own function and it's just this empty function, right? But we're doing something a little more complicated than that. This function is being treated as a JSX component function. So when we call it here, it's automatically going to get a set of props, basically. Like, it's going to get this thing called props. Even if we don't pass anything into it, React will do that for us. So if you want to see really quick what's coming into it right now when we haven't done anything yet, we can do a quick console log here. And let's just print out what these props are. If I go back here and I open up my developer tool, my console, okay, you'll see right here, that little line that I just put in here did output something. And you would think it'd be nothing, right? We're not passing anything in, but it's not undefined and it's not null. It actually is getting an object. The object is empty. React essentially sees our JSX here, sees that we're calling this, and what it's essentially doing here secretly is it's calling our title function and it's passing in props, which in this case is just an empty object. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but this is all part of the stuff that's going on under the hood that you really don't have to worry about, but it's good to have some sense of how it's working. So in our case, we want to change that from an empty object into an object with something in it. So let's say we're going to expect props to come in with a title. So we do props.title here. Oops, and I've got to put that in my curly braces. You'll notice I don't have to. That's another mistake you can make really easily. You go back here. Now it just prints out props.title. At least that's an easy one to track down the problem. So put that inside curly braces, right? And now let's go back in and see what we get there. We get nothing. We don't get any errors. We simply don't see anything on screen. And I believe if I check my console, you also won't see any errors here. You see some warnings here, but that's just because we're not using that text variable. Because what we are doing here is props.title is undefined. That like we have an empty object, and when I try to grab a property on that object that isn't defined, I get back the value of undefined, which is perfectly valid in JavaScript. And you can put undefined as the child of an H1 tag, and it just won't print anything out. It doesn't consider that a mistake. It thinks, okay, cool, this is nothing, so I'm just going to print nothing. And you won't see any errors. So again, this is the thing to watch for if you're having problems. Sometimes things won't show you errors and tell you clearly, oh, hey, you're expecting something here that you didn't get. Instead, you'll just have React kind of try to carry on, and it will just give you nothing. So if we want to actually give that a value, though, we pass the same way we're passing class name, href, target, rel here into these different tags. We're going to pass in a prop directly from that we have created in this case, and it can be anything we want. It's not going to stop us. We can pass in props we don't even use here, and it won't matter. So you also have to be careful there. And there's ways to validate props so that you can actually you can make sure you're passing in the stuff you're expecting. But when you're just dealing with vanilla React like we are right now, it's totally freeform. So we know, of course, we want title to be in here. So we're just going to pass in a title. And I'm going to just pass in that text variable. I could also just pass in text directly if I want, but we already have a variable, so let's go ahead and do that. So now what's happening here is title, the component, is getting a prop as part of its props object called title. And now props.title should have a value. And there it is. If I want to pass in more stuff, let's look, if we want a subtitle, for example. Pass that in as well. Now, if I just add that right now and I don't use it here, nothing happens and no errors. So that's totally valid. You can pass in unused props. You won't even get warned about it unless you have some kind of special setup. But let's say I actually do want to show it. So we just use props.subtitle right underneath that. And now we have our subtitle. Now, again, props are coming in from outside the object and we don't want to change them. If I try to change them, if I try to say props title equals new title, I will actually get an error. This is, you'll notice up until this point, we have not been seeing this kind of screen very much. React rarely stops short and just like says, no, you can't do this. But this is one of the rules it will enforce. It will actually stop you from trying to change a read-only property because it knows that props are not supposed to change. That's not the point of props. The whole point of props is that ideally this header we're creating here should be, know as little as possible about the data it's getting. All it needs to know is I'm going to get some data and I'm going to display it this way. And I don't care what it is. I don't need to know what it is. I'm just going to do it. And the advantage to that is that you can really be very thoughtful about where any kind of actual business logic you're creating lives. So if something breaks, if we're doing complicated stuff to the user's name, or even not complicated stuff, a common thing you might be doing is the user has a first name and a last name. You just want to put them together, right? Something simple like that. Maybe you want to, add like a title at the end of it or something like that. If you know that your display is only ever going to display that name and something screws up with that name, it's much easier for you to track down where the problem is because your component is simply displaying data. It can't be something with the component because the data is just being passed through. This is generally the pattern you want to try to follow. Again, you don't have to. You can kind of do whatever you want, but this is the kind of thing that React encourages and makes it very simple to do through things like props by treating the stuff that you pass into a component as immutable, something the component can't screw around with it, can't do anything that might mutate state up the chain anywhere. That's another important thing to keep in mind. So it's just a good way to sort of develop good habits and work within like React strengths, basically. How's everyone doing so far?
So I have a question. When we're doing title equals curly bracket text, is it being treated as a key value pair?
Are you talking about this?
Correct. The way that we're actually like feeding it through, and then
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Props looks like this. So it's essentially a key value pair. It's just a JavaScript object. So now it's like, my value and then subtitle. Like this is what you end up actually passing in. And you can treat it that way too. There's way, if you don't want to like write props dot everywhere, for example, you can do object deconstruction. Or destructuring, not destructuring, where you do something like this, where you directly pull the keys out from the object that you want to use, and then they become variables. You might see something like this a lot. Just be a nice way to kind of clean up your code, because if you have a big complicated object and you don't want to see the name of that object everywhere, this will behave the exact same way. You can even go a step farther than that, and you can just say, I don't need props at all. Like, as far as I'm concerned, you're passing me this object that contains these two keys and values. And that also works. This is all the same way of doing the same thing, though. Like, this is just different syntax, but all the same. You're getting an object, it has keys, the keys have values, and then you're using those values. You're displaying the values here. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Cool. All right, I'm going to do one more little added complication. I think it would be a good time to take a break after that, since we've been at this for a little over an hour. But I wanted to show that as well as you can pass anything as a prop, essentially. Any JavaScript structure can be passed in. It doesn't have to just be text or numbers or anything like that. You can actually pass in a function. This is something that's pretty powerful, and you will see quite a bit of. So if we want something that the header actually does, let's say it has like a log out button in it or something like that. That's a pretty common use case. Again, we're trying to keep this header very simple, right? We don't want it to know about the entire rest of the workings of the app. It would be great if this header just shows a button and it clicks the button and it just calls a prop rather than calling some complicated function that ties into our whole logout structure or anything like that. So that allows us to keep the header very simple, reuse it in many places where maybe it's not doing the same functionality exactly, pull it into other apps entirely. This can be a really great way to keep your code really modular and not introduce a lot of places where you can cause complicated errors. So as an example, we're not going to do any logging out here. We're just going to show a simple alert. But we're going to pass in a function that will deal with pushing a button. So first, we're going to create that button. I'm just going to put it right here under the logo. I'm just going to use the basic HTML button, right? Say click me. So I can't see this because my controls are in front of it. Okay, it's very small, but it's there. So I created a button. It's part of the component. I'm actually going to put it higher up because it's getting lost. I'll put it above the image. All right. It doesn't do anything. It's because it has no on-click handler, right? It just shows up, essentially. So I want this button to show an alert when it gets clicked, but I don't want the header to know what it's doing. The header should just know, hey, I clicked the button, and just tell its parent, like a small child, like, I clicked the button, like you do what you need to do. And that's how we're going to use the prop callback. So in addition to a title and a subtitle here, we're gonna pull in, on click or on click button, maybe, in case we have multiple things here. And we're gonna pass that into the on click handler here. And you can see that the patterns we're following here are kind of what HTML is already doing. This button already has this click handler that you pass into it. And the HTML button doesn't know what it does. It just knows, hey, I was clicked, do your thing. And we're essentially just taking that one step higher and doing it ourselves because we're wrapping this whole header in its own functionality. So now I'm assuming that my props contain an onClick button value. I'm passing that into the button. I haven't done anything yet though, right? This is still undefined. So if I click on the button now, still nothing happens because actually this is exactly what we just had. The value for onClick for this button is undefined, which is totally valid. You won't see any error messages here. This is what the browser considers okay. React considers it okay, but of course nothing's happening. So you need to make sure that it actually happens. So coming back down here, just the same way we passed in title and the same way we passed in subtitle, we'll pass in onClick button. And inside onClick button, we want to pass in a callback function. This is the same thing we were doing earlier when we were mapping. I'm creating a value here. I'm using this arrow syntax here as a way to say like this is a function. You might see that in a lot of places, but there's other ways to do this as well. Like for example, like this is essentially the same thing as this using the word function. So you might see these used interchangeably, but everything in JavaScript is a function, even though there's multiple ways to write that out. It doesn't actually change the behavior. Well, it does change it in certain subtle ways that I don't think are important to go into right now. So inside this callback function we're passing in, I'm going to just have an alert that says hello. And great. So now onClick button has a value. The value is this function. That function gets passed into the onClick function here. And if everything is connected correctly and I click this, I should get an alert. And I do. So this right here, now the header no longer needs to know anything about this function. I can make this the most complicated function in existence. It can tie deeply into all these other systems that are happening in our app. I can do whatever I want, and the header never needs to change. It is now connected to that function, and all it knows is I got clicked, call the click function, I'm done. And that's a great way to just really stay focused and keep the header focused on the only thing it needs to do, which is display the data and interact with the user, and it doesn't need to know anything beyond that. Now, one thing to remember here, though, is this is very key because this is a super easy mistake to make. I do it all the time. If you don't pass this in as a function, but if you forget that front part of this and pass this in instead, you're going to see some slightly different behavior. So let's say I'm working pretty quickly and I'm like, okay, when you click the button, I want you to just call alert hello. Now, when I go back to the screen, you'll notice the screen refreshed while I was doing that, and it just says hello, and it keeps saying hello. And now clicking the button does nothing. So what's going on there? If I refresh the page again, there's hello before anything even loads. And it keeps happening, except for when I want it to. So what's going on there? Well, what's happening is I didn't pass a function into onClick button. I called the function, and I'm passing the result of that function into onClick button. That's the key thing, and that's why it's important to put this in the beginning here. And again, JavaScript being JavaScript, it doesn't care that I did that. It's just like, okay, I'm going to call this function, which causes the alert to just pop up on screen the second this renders. That then returns undefined. It's like, okay, cool, I got undefined back from this function. I'm going to pass undefined into onClick button, which goes into this onClick handler. And now again, the button doesn't do anything, but the thing still popped up. And again, I cannot stress how easy it is to make this mistake. You'll probably do it a lot, no matter how good you get at this. But at least at this point, you'll start to understand, hopefully, why it's happening, and it's a pretty quick fix. That makes sense to everybody so far?
Hey, I'm sorry. Can you just remind me why you contain the props in an object?
Mm-hmm. I don't. React does. That's just how it works. Part of the reason I think is because that's the only way they would be named. The other way, if these were coming into the function as like individual parameters like this, now these are the names that the title component is giving to these, and it's just going by the order they're coming in, essentially. So That would be the only other way to do it, I think. And that would be really like less than ideal, because then you would need to make sure that these are in the exact same order if you screwed them up. And this is all hypothetical. This is assuming React worked in a way it doesn't work.
Yeah, it
but
threw an
the
error
truth-
message for me when I didn't have it contained in an object. So maybe.
Yes. So, okay. Yeah. So that's another interesting thing about JavaScript is like so let's say I do this and I don't have the object, right? So now I'm saying, okay, I'm title, I'm a function. I take 3 parameters, title, subtitle, and on-click button. React is going to call this. It doesn't care what you called these. React is going to see this. It's going to be like, okay, title, I'm calling you. Here's your props object. So your entire props object is now going to be title. And then these are just going to be undefined, because the function will just kind of carry on. It's like, okay, I've been called. I was called with title, which is an object, actually all the props that React just handed you. Subtitle, that's undefined. On-click button, that's undefined. Cool. And then it's just going to try to go through with that. So what you'll end up seeing here is nothing, because it's trying to display objects, which it doesn't like. You'll notice here, this didn't pop up as an error, as that big error that happened when we tried to edit the props, right? This showed up in our console. So you have sort of different like layers of error handling here going on. There's the actual, that big error that actually filled up the whole screen and was quite helpful was React's error message. Now React is just failing, and it's just console logging these error messages.
So I actually do get the error page. It says objects are not valid as a React child. Found object keys, title, subtitle, on-click button. If you mention regular collection.
Oh, there we go. I just needed to refresh. Interesting. So it only did that when I fully refreshed, not the hot refresh. Okay, cool. Well, this is much more helpful. These these might seem annoying at first, but these are great. It is so nice to have a big, huge error message showing you what got screwed up, like right there, and trying to point you towards the problem as best it can. Like this is something that there is unfortunately far too little of in the JavaScript world. So yeah, what happens here is, so again, yeah, title is now your props object, and we were trying to just print out the props object. You can't do that. It doesn't like objects in JSX like that. You notice before we had an array and it was fine with that, but an object is not okay. JSX just won't allow it, essentially. So if we put this back into curly braces though, now this function knows I'm getting an object, and within that object are the keys, title, subtitle, on-click button. And I'm going to use the values that those keys point to, and I'm going to print those out. That makes sense?
Yeah.
If this is like, yeah, no problem. And this is weird, like, don't feel bad about just doing this for a while if this like makes it easier for you to wrap your head around it. Like the other way is cleaner, but it's all about what makes the most sense to you as a developer and anyone you're working with. So this is the exact same thing. I'm taking in an object and I'm using the keys of that object, and it doesn't like that. Oh, okay. I just need to refresh. So there, you'll notice my little watchman failed me, and it didn't actually fully react. So if you're getting some weird behavior, sometimes you just got to refresh the whole page and it'll fix it. Sometimes you might need to restart the server. There are little issues like that here and there. Cool. So now we're back to where we were before, and all is right with our header. Cool. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to shout them out now. And if not, I think it'd be a good time to take a little break and regroup in like 10 minutes. That sound good to people?
Yep, sounds great.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. See you. Let's give everyone like a minute to trickle back in. This will be a good time for me to check in on the chat. In case there's anything there.
We got any college basketball fans?
Huge college basketball fan, Louisville Cardinals.
Yeah, dude. Y'all ready for that Gonzaga UCLA game tonight?
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm thinking about putting money on Gonzaga.
I think that's probably a good bet.
All right, well, you know what another good bet is? Using state. Yeah, it's the best segue I came up with there, sorry. Anyway, using state. So we talked about props, the external values you pass into a component. But a few of you mentioned state already. It sounds like you've gotten an overview of that. State is another way that you're dealing with changing data in your app, but it's a set of internal values that are managed within the component instead of passed into it from outside. I see a hand up, or is that not intentional?
Yeah, that was me.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I had a question about right after break, we talked about destructuring objects. And I was curious if you destructure the object and then later, let's say you add a prop, you pass an additional prop that is not in that destructured set. Does that throw an error, or does it just like not populate that one?
If you pass in anything into here that you don't use, then no, it will not share an error. It will not throw any kind of error. So that would be like the equivalent of what you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly. So it's like, are you saying like, so if we go back to this where we have like title, subtitle, on click button, right, instead of props, and say we pass in, new thing like that.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
That will not do anything. Essentially, the props do contain this. Title has access to it, but React doesn't care that it's not using it. So if we go back in here, you'll see no errors either here or elsewhere. So
thank you.
Sure, that's something you generally want to avoid if you can, because it's confusing. Again, like future you is going to see I'm passing new thing into this component that must be used somewhere, and then we'll be a little surprised to find that no, it's not. There's ways to, and again, there's ways you can be a little more prescriptive about exactly what goes into your components. Typescript is what we use typically for that. So Typescript is like a extra bit of helper stuff on top of JavaScript that ensures you're always using the same kind of, you're declaring exactly what type of data you're sending in. So you're trying to eliminate a lot of that ambiguity that's just inherent to JavaScript. So you could say, for example, here that like title is a string, subtitle is a string, on click button is a function. And you would explicitly tell the title component that that's what it's getting. And if it got anything it wasn't expecting, it wouldn't throw an error while you're running it, but it would at least underline it in your code editor. So you could see, okay, that's not what it's supposed to be doing. And similarly, I think it would also, depending on your settings, it would tell you, hey, you're passing new thing into this, but it's not being used, or that's not part of the props that it's expecting. And then you have a little bit of a warning there that something's going on where your code is not matching, expectations. That's one option. There's also this thing called prop types, which is what used to be built into React and which they deprecated, but it was the same idea. You told it, these are exactly the props that you're supposed to be getting. And it would then throw warnings if it got something it didn't expect.
Thank you very much.
Sure. I see another hand.
Yeah, it's kind of similar question along the same lines. Is there a way to kind of like define default values? So if we want to pass a value into title, we can, but if we choose not to pass something in, is there a way, is it just like other functions? You just put the identifier and then an equals, and then it'll overwrite it if it gets something and it won't if it doesn't?
Yeah, that's exactly what you do. So yeah, I can put it there, write my destructuring statement up the top. I can give it a value, and now I'm no longer passing title in. If I do pass title in, then it will override it. So yeah, you have that ability to do that too.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing you could do is if you sometimes know that this might just have no value, you can use the OR operator, which is two pipes like that. And this will basically say, like, if title has a value, show the title. If it doesn't, then show this instead. And that basically works the same way. The only difference is you're not actually giving title a value. You are simply displaying something differently if it's not there. So that's a couple ways that we might handle that in a React situation. Okay. Any other questions before we move on to state? Cool. All right. So state is a little bit interesting to talk about now, as when I started giving this talk, you just used class components for everything in React, and they have largely now moved on to functional components, which is what you're seeing in the app currently. So there's two ways to manage state. Generally, have you learned about the class components? Are you going to be going through that? Is that worth talking about? Because at this point, I could honestly just skip it, but I'm not sure what the.
So yeah, we're for our curriculum, we're definitely going to focus on function components. We do cover class components a bit, as in some of our challenges might kind of have it. So our approach, and we'll refer to what you think is relevant, is that currently a lot of code might be class-based components, because that was kind of like the past hotness, and the new hotness is function-based components. So we do want to introduce both, but we are definitely focusing on functional components. So I think it might be good to kind of just see it, just to kind of reiterate what what's class-based components might kind of look like, but based on what your thoughts are.
Sure. I think I'll just focus on functional then, and if we get to it, then we can do class stuff as well. Because yeah, it's valuable if you're going to be looking at any like legacy code bases or anything. You might see a lot of that, or you might see old tutorials that use it, and it's good to understand how it works. I don't think there's a great argument for using it anymore if you're not just working with legacy code. Although it does offer a bit of structure if you have a lot of complicated states. So there's a trade-off, but so far all the holdouts at TableXI at least have finally gone over to functional components. We had a few people who just did not want to let go of classes, and they were eventually convinced.
Yeah.
So that to me is a sign.
I've not developed too much in React, but I feel like the one benefit of classes are like the lifecycle methods. It's nice to kind of have those discrete functions that are going to get called instead of using the hooks. But that's just my opinion.
It's true, yeah. Although a lot of them have been deprecated, and anyway, and the use effect hook is sort of supposed to replace that, which has its own quirks. But yeah, I know what you mean. It was a little bit clearer what was going on in some ways. The functions are a little more automagical, but so yeah. So traditionally, you would have this is the whole reason why you can't use class, and you have to use class name instead. Is that you could also write this function out as a class app, and it extends React component, and you would have a render method in that, and everything that's in here basically goes into that render method. And this is actually still sort of happening under the hood. It's all the same code. It's just two different ways for you to write it. And you would manage state within this class in a very specific way. And what they moved to instead is now they have these things called hooks. And hooks are essentially these little functions that you bring in from React that give you extra functionality that you kind of just use as needed. So when you're managing state in a component, you manage each variable independently, essentially. It used to be you would have this one big state object, and you would change that. And they've moved to this sort of, you're changing more discrete things. So if you have a lot of variables, it can get a little hairy, but generally you probably shouldn't have a lot of variables anyway. That's a good argument for breaking things up into smaller components. So, so yeah, like, right, we already have variables in here, right? And you can, let's say we want to like start changing those on the fly. And let's see what actually happens here. So let's say, I have a variable inside of title here now. I'm just going to create one. I'm going to make it a let variable so I can change it. And it'll be change me equals 1, right? And let's say when I click the button, I want to also make this, right? I'm just going to ignore my old click handler, right? For the time being. I'm going to create a new function here, and I'm going to change that change me to 2 every time when I click the button, right? So I just say change me equals 2. And then I'll have to print it out somewhere so you can actually see it. Okay, so let's go back into our header here. So everything's still the same, button's still there. Now we see change me. We see that it's equal to 1, which is what I said in here when we render it for the first time. And then when I click that button, I want it to change to 2, right? So I'm clicking it. That's weird. Nothing's happening, right? Now what's going on there? Let's do a quick console log and see, is the value actually changing? So I'm using semicolons here. Let's see what the value is. I'm going to go back into the browser, open up my developer tools. I'm going to click on this. Interesting, it says change me equals 2, but this isn't changing. Well, that's because I'm not using state, and this is what state is for. I did change that value. The value is changed exactly like I wanted, because again, everything that's happening in JSX is just regular JavaScript and will behave that way. But the diffing algorithm that I mentioned way back when, the thing that's actually updating our UI when the state changes, is only going to respond to changes in React state. It's not going to respond to every single change of JavaScript that you do. Instead, it has, you have to pass it through the right channels for it to get noticed. So that's where state hooks come in. So let's try this again. I'm going to go up to the top here and I'm going to import something from React. It's called useState. And mine autofills it. Yours may or may not do that, but this is the import you want to grab. So useState, it's a hook. So it's a function. We're going to call this function and it's going to give us 2 things. It's going to give us a variable and it's going to give us a function to change that variable. And we name those and we can give it a default value. So the syntax might look a little weird, but so instead of change me here, we're going to do this. We're going to say these are going to be constants because we're not changing them. We're changing them through the hook. So as far as these almost function like props in a sense that are just coming from a different place. They're like props from React that we can change by calling a special function, and then it kind of gives us back a prop again. So we're gonna do something like this. So we'll say change me and then set change me. I'm gonna give it a better name than this. We'll just call it num value, set num value type equals use state. Okay, so this might look a little weird seeing this these array brackets here, but what's actually happening here is when we call use state, it's giving us back an array with 2 elements in it. And the first element is our variable. The second element is the function that changes that element. So this is actually just basically, it's kind of like, it's just object destructuring again. Like you could do it this way too, where you say, num value equals state stuff 0. This is actually what we're doing there. Basically, we're pulling out those values and we're giving them names. So this is typically how you do it. So, use state doesn't make any assumptions about what kind of value this is, but we can pass in a default value, which will help it behave a little more normally if it's ambiguous. So in this case, let's say we want num value to be 0 at the beginning. And we'll go back here to change me. Let's call this num value. We're going to add our num value here and delete everything inside on click. Okay, so we've got this num value. We're getting back a default value from use state, which is 0. So when I display it on screen here, I should see 0, and I do. Great, so that's working. Nothing happens when I click now because I'm not changing anything yet. So let's go into onClick here. And this is where that set num value function that useState gave us back is going to come into handy. And I call that, I'm going to set that to, I'll set it to 1, I guess, in this case. So every time when I click the button, it's going to set that value to 1. Now everything works, everything updates. This is the flow that React wants you to do. It wants you to be deliberate about when you're changing state. This is kind of, I think, an important choice on their part, because if it were just trying to display changes anytime your JavaScript changed, it'd be a mess. This way you get to very discreetly say, I'm changing the state and I want you to know about it so that you can update the UI for me. how's that making sense to people so far? Any questions on that?
Okay, can you go back to your code real quick?
Yep.
Quinn, can you go over that just very briefly one more time, how you did that?
Yeah. So what I did is I pulled in the useState hook from React. And the hook is a function that's going to give us some state to work with. It's going to give us a single variable and a single function to change that variable. If I want more variables, I can keep calling it, and I can do, new thing, set new thing equals useState. And this could be something else. This could be a string, right? I can do this as many times as I want. Every time useState is going to give me back a new variable, new function to change it. They don't overlap at all. So in this case, I'm giving these my own names so that I can refer to them. React doesn't really care what the name is or what the type of data is yet until I start using it. So now our component, our functional component, has this little bit of state. It's got a value called numValue and a way to change it. And when I change it, React will update the UI automatically. So I went back down into the button here, and in the onClick handler, I'm now ignoring the prop that I passed in before. I just want to get this to work now. I call set numValue, which is the function it gave me here to change that variable. So if I also want to set new thing, I can call that here as well. And I can actually display new thing down here so you can see the change. So, and then, yeah, I just added some extra stuff at the bottom to make it visible when the change happens. So now when I click this, both of those change at the same time. And that's all there really is to hooks. Hooks are designed to work like this as a kind of quick drop-in bit of functionality and not be any more complex than that. And this is different from the way it used to work. In a class-based old school component, you had a state object that worked the same way props did. It was kind of designed to mirror it. So it looks something like this, and you would be changing different values of the state, and you had to call a special function called setState to do it, which worked kind of the same way. Like you couldn't just change it, or again, you could change it. You could actually just mutate the values on your own, but React didn't know that it had changed, so it wouldn't update the UI. So they've stuck with the same paradigm, which is that they want you to be really deliberate about when you're changing state and when that's actually going to affect the UI, essentially. I think I said hand.
Yeah, Quinn, could you set the on your button on the on click? Can you just have it? Can you pass in just a function that adds one every time you click, as opposed to just moving it to one?
Actually, that's my little challenge for all of you. That's
okay.
What I'm going to have you do next. I'm not even using my slides anymore. Yeah, here we go. That's actually exactly where we're at in the presentation now. I want to give you all some time. I'll keep my code up here so you can use this as reference. I'll paste it in the chat too, maybe if that's helpful to anybody. Here's my entire function. I don't know how this is going to format. That's actually not terrible. Okay. If you want to grab that as a sample, I'll leave this up. I'll give you all about 10 minutes to start with. I usually end up extending it if people are having issues. And yeah, exactly. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but the person who just spoke, exactly like you just said, why don't we have the click button rather than just setting the value and then being done with it? We're going to create an actual counter, and it's going to go up every single time that you click. And you should be able to see that counter go up on your screen. And I'm here for questions during this process. So yeah, we'll check in a little after 11 and see how people are doing. All right, so I'm just going to ignore this right now, keep things simple. All right, so I've removed my other new little bit of state. I'm back to just having this num value. We can call this, click count. so we know what it means. Currently, I'm setting it to 1, but not actually incrementing it. So this is actually a one-line change. It doesn't need to be super complicated. I'm just going to set the num value to whatever the current value is plus 1. And that's it. So that will just keep going up as the value increases. And as long as this view doesn't reload entirely, that value will continue to go up. If I refresh the page, of course, it disappears. I see that hand. I think you're muted.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I created 3 buttons: an add, a subtract, and then like a reset. And the way that I did reset was just num value minus num value. But is there a way to do num value equals use state? So like reset it to whatever it defaults to, opposed to just subtracting it from itself? Because I wasn't able to get that part to work.
I would probably just create a default value like this, and then just use that in both places. So you could create a new button here. Oops. And this will be our reset button, and that can just set num value to default value. And so if we go up a whole bunch, hit reset, and it goes back to 0. Since they're pulling from the same thing. I don't know if there's a way to grab, like to capture what the default value is once it's already been set, but I don't think you'd ever need to. Like this is the approach I would do. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. I see what you did. It's like, cool. Thank you.
Sure. Great. Any other questions on that? Hopefully this is starting to feel a little more comfortable to people.
Maybe I misunderstood this, but I thought we were supposed to turn this into a class.
Oh, you sorry, that was my old slide. I said you could do it as a class or as a hook. Yeah, if you did do it as a class, I can quickly show you what that looks like, just so demystify that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, let's, well, here, I'll just call this functional title so we can use it as a reference. So redoing this as a class is pretty simple. It's basically just adding a bit more code around it. So I'm going to create a title class. Now this, of course, is no longer being used down here. I have to extend React component. This is because it's inheriting all the functionality from there. And I'm going to create a render method, which is going to contain basically all of this. It's not going to contain the hooks because those won't work. And in fact, oh, interesting. It actually lets me do that. No, it doesn't. Okay, yeah. You'll see right away, it doesn't like use state. Use state can't be used here. Use state only works in the new functional components. So instead of that, I can still have my default value here. Actually, what I would do is this. So I would create the state right up here. State equals, can't remember. Yeah, that's it. Okay, I create the state of the component at the top level here, and I would have num value be part of that. And I would set that to 0 as its default. Or I guess here I could do. Okay. Make that default value. Okay. You'll notice also you're going to start seeing this a lot. The word this inside classes is very significant in JavaScript. So once I create the state, the props, this default value I've created up here, they all belong under the this object, which is called the context of a JavaScript class, and they have to be accessed through that. Otherwise, it treats everything as if I try to grab just default value, it won't know what that is because it's looking for it either in the context of that one function or it's hoping it's out here in the global context somewhere. But anything that's supposed to be available to everything in a class has to be prepended by that. So down here, I no longer need this. Here's my render method. Okay, now Carson no longer knows what title, subtitle, all the default value, all this stuff is, because these are now part of the props. So the way I would grab these now is this .props.title, or I could destructure props at the top of here if I want. It still gets passed in the same way as before. I don't have to think about it. The props object just exists on the component once it's displayed in JSX, but the way I access it in a class is different. So I think it's this default value. So set num value no longer works. So in this case, I would be using this .set state. And much like set num value, I have to call this to change the state in a class. I can't just change the value, or rather I can change the value, but it's going to be the same thing that we experienced earlier where I was updating that value, but it wasn't changing the screen. Same thing. The value will change. The React doesn't consider it a change and won't respond to it. So instead I have to do this .set state. And in this case, I would give it, what you do when you set state is you pass in the change you want to make. You don't pass in the entire new state. If there's more stuff in the state, like this won't get overwritten unless I tell it to. So what I would do here is when I click, I would set the num value and I would grab the existing num value, which is this .state.num value +1. So it's kind of the same thing. It's more code, but it's doing the exact same thing. And for my reset here, same deal. I have to set state, pass in a new num value, and that's going to be this default value. And this, of course, needs to be this .state.num value. It's just a lot more kind of boilerplate code. But so yeah, we've added more code, but we're doing the same thing. And if I go back to my view here, everything should still work the same way. And the reset works as well. And like I said, just to demonstrate, if I don't set state and I just change the value, right, like that, I think it will even right there, it'll start yelling at me. Do not mutate state directly. Okay, so I've got a nice little warning. Your code editor may or may not give you that same warning, but it does tell me not to do it. But it's just a warning, it's not an error. So it'll work, but nothing updates. So you have to call this .set state the same way you have to call, your hooks set function that it gave back to you. Yeah, but otherwise, like I said, everything that's going on under the hood is essentially the same as this. Functional components are just sort of a newer, cleaner, quicker way to make small things, because I think React reasoned that most of your components are really just returning JSX. They're just displaying something. They're not doing a lot of other logic. And if you want to do a lot of logic, you probably shouldn't be doing it in components at all, which is why I think there's been a movement towards these. Classes sort of encourage you to add more complexity to your components than maybe you should. You can add all sorts of class functions and stuff like that. And I think that ultimately the React really shines when you treat your components as simply as possible. And the more complexity you give to them, usually that's worse. But again, it's up to you. React is not going to stop you from doing what you want to do, and that may or may not, be the best pattern. Does that make sense? The class stuff? Okay. Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Let's go back to our functional title. That should be the same thing. Yeah. Great. All right, so moving on. So typically, this is always a good turning point. We've actually gotten, it's funny, you've all asked a lot of questions, which is awesome. And we've gotten much farther than I usually get. I usually don't get to this part of the presentation. There's like a whole bunch of stuff in this presentation I never get to because we never have time. I'm hoping to sort of stop around 11:30 and use that time to just answer any remaining questions about React or about, TableXI or development in general or anything you're interested in. So we can have a little time to do that. But I do have this segment here where we make a simple form just as a way to kind of get a sense of the sort of thing you might be doing in a real production app, something that you might actually be responding to. this can get a little complicated, but I do think we have enough time to just get started on it. But before I do, is there anything anyone wants to cover in a little more detail that might make a little bit more sense to them if we go through it? I want to make sure that this is valuable use of your time.
Here, one small thing. I mean, hopefully it could be very quick. So I was making a button that can subtract. Also, I had an add up and subtract button. I just want to know, can I throw a conditional in there? So like if it has to be greater than 0.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I think that's more useful than my planned thing with the form, because this comes up a lot. Conditional rendering is a great thing to check out. So yeah, let's try that. So you want to make it, okay, yeah, let's do 2 things here. You want to make it so you cannot go below 0.
That's correct.
Cool, that's a great thing. So let's start with that. And let's also, after that, let's make it so you don't see the component unless it's above 0, because that's the kind of thing you will be doing a lot of. So I'm gonna just ignore the class title here for now, but I'll keep it up there so I can just copy all this code over for people later to reference. Go back to this. I'll add a subtract button as well. So just above our, I'll say, make this a little more descriptive. So our click me button is going to become add. I'm just going to copy this and paste it and make a subtract button, but I will subtract from here. Okay, so now I think everyone's following. I now have 2 buttons. One of them adds, one subtracts, but subtract and keep going well below 0, right? So how do I stop this from happening? You have a lot of flexibility here because everything that's happening here is just JavaScript. So you could, you could pass this on to some complicated validation function if you want, but in our case, we don't need to do much. So what I would probably just do is just check the existing value. So if this num value, you could do, so one way you could do is check if this num value is more than or equal to 0, or I guess more than 0, right? Not equal to 0. We will then do this. Indentation is all off. So if we go back here, well, now it's not going to work yet, so I have to refresh the page because it was already above 0. Whoop. Oh, haha. I did this dot num value because I'm in the mindset of doing classes. I don't need this dot num value. Interesting how it didn't stop me from doing that though. Another fun JavaScript quirk, right? It's just like, okay, I guess there's an object called this, and I guess it's got num value. This is also an interesting thing to note, that you notice how it actually crashed there when I tried to do something to this dot num value. If I just did, if this is over 0, you won't get that. Even though this is meaningless, right? I mean, it does mean something, but like JavaScript is taking the entire context of my function, which is not a number, and trying to see if it's more than 0, which doesn't make any sense. So it's not more than 0. So this is false. But notice how it didn't give me any error. And again, JavaScript just tries to keep calm and carry on, and it will just try to move forward even if what you're doing makes no sense, unless you do what I did here, where I said this dot num value. Now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to access a property that doesn't exist, and I'm trying to do something with it. That's the only time when JavaScript gets angry. If it were just undefined, then it's okay. But if I try to access a property of undefined, which doesn't exist, or in this case, this, is a thing that exists, like the word this is a JavaScript object that exists and is important and does not contain num value. So when I try to do an operation on that, then it actually breaks. Yeah, because, yeah, actually, I guess, never mind. This in this instance doesn't exist because we're not in a class. So it's a tricky distinction, but in some ways this is nice. You kind of want it to crash when you're doing something that makes no sense. You want it to tell you, hey, this doesn't exist. And it's annoying sometimes that JavaScript won't do that. So it's just important to know, though, that's the threshold. That's the point also where your users of your website will notice something is wrong, because it's actually going to like crash, as opposed to you noticing something's wrong because it's not behaving the way it should in a sort of more subtle way. Anyway, so that was a little bit of a digression. In our case, we just want to see, okay, is num value over 0, then we can do this. So I can add a bunch, subtract will work until we get to 0, then it stops. That's one simple way. The other way you can do this, if you want to get a little fancier, maybe if you're doing something more complicated than just subtraction, is you could use a built-in math function here. We can use math.max. So math is a whole big library inside of JavaScript that can do all sorts of stuff. If you want to do square roots or complicated things, it's built into this, which is pretty cool. I don't really use it much, but it's just nice to know it exists because I don't want to try to implement that stuff on my own. And it has this function called max. This will return the larger of two values. So if I set num value -1 or 0, then it's never going to return anything larger than, it's never going to return anything under 0, basically. And this is another way to do it. So I come back here. This will be the exact same functionality, but this would allow me to add a little more complexity to it, maybe if I want. It always tries to run it essentially, but I guess the only difference here really is that I'm still setting the value every time. The earlier version, I was deciding if we're 0 or below, don't change the value. Here I'm saying if it's below 0, change the value to 0. In this case, it's practically the same, but that could have implications that go beyond that if you're doing something more complicated. How's that? That make sense to people?
It does. I'm a little curious, and not Kevin. Hopefully I didn't just cut you off there. I apologize if I did. We're doing this validation on the component level, and I'm trying to like understand, like, should components only display stuff? And like, I'm trying to like wrap my head around, like, when should a component do something? Like, we're doing some validation logic, I guess, inside our component. And I almost feel like, should that validation, and it seems like it's just fine here, but when do we put the validation in the component, and when do we say, oh, we should never pass that in or something? I don't know if that even makes sense, but I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to think about.
I think so. You're saying, like, should we just not even allow the user to click the button, like disable it?
Yeah, that's what I guess I'm trying to think about. What level do we put in? What level do we put in these validations, I guess, is what I'm trying to think about. But maybe in this case.
Yeah, in a real app, you're going to have kind of a couple layers of validation. You have the sort of the actual, like the server, for example, should have validation for sure, and it should never accept values that don't make any sense. It should be sanitizing everything so you can't get sneaky attacks, you know, that kind of stuff. The server should be the ultimate source of truth, and if you try to give it something it doesn't like, it should just error out and give you a descriptive error saying, don't do this, right? So that you definitely want. In addition to that, you probably also want, you generally have form validation, and most of the form libraries you use will have that all built in, where you want to ideally tell the user they're making an obvious mistake before they ever even get to the server. And this is more of a UX question because it's going to be instantaneous. You want to give if the user's doing something wrong, you want to give them that feedback right away so they can fix it and they don't have to wait for that response. So you will often do both. You would, if for example, your email address has to be properly formatted as an email address. That's a common case. If the user screws that up, you could just wait until they send their form to the API, and then the API comes back and says, hey, this email address is wrong. But you can also just be checking as they're typing, essentially like, okay, they had focus on this text box where they're entering their email address, and that lost focus, so they're done. But that's not formatted like an email address. So I'm going to make this red and put a note underneath it that says, hey, this needs to be properly formatted. And that's a design consideration. You want to be nice to your users. So there's multiple reasons for validation, and one is the security and safety of your backend, and the other is like giving the user the best possible experience when they've done something wrong so that they can fix things easily.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. But on that note, let's go ahead and do that. Let's do a little bit of something more complicated. So one thing we could do is we could just not show this button at all if the value is below 0. You just won't be able to subtract. So that's very clear to the user, right? So the way we do that is I'm just going to keep this in here. There's no reason to remove it. So they still can't set the value below it. But I'm going to wrap this whole thing in some curly braces, which is going to make it a little mad. And inside here, what I can do is I'm going to use a little bit of if then shorthand. So I'm going to say if num value is over 0 and that basically says that's just a shortened version of if num value is over 0, execute this, essentially show this. So you'll probably see stuff like this a lot in React code because it doesn't quite let you put in full-on if-then statements. Usually if you have to do that, you have to do it up above here. I'll show you how to do that in a second, actually, just so you know what I'm talking about. But I believe this should work. Okay, cool. So we're at 0. You notice button is gone. As soon as I start adding, though, button appears. Start subtracting, button's gone. Just like anything else in our view here, it just reacts instantaneously to that change in state. This kind of thing is just, it's a dream compared to how you used to have to do like some logic like this. It's not that complicated, but having to change your UI depending on the state of the data in a way that's accurate and consistent and doesn't like break easily was such a chore before React came along. And now it's like pretty easy. It's just, okay, this block is right here. I can clearly see the condition I need to be able to see this output. And if it's not there, it simply isn't there. So another thing we could do is maybe, since it's kind of weird how the whole thing bounces up and down when that button disappears, we could make the button disabled based on whether or not the value is wrong. So disabled is built into HTML buttons, and we can just set this value to, okay, if the num value is less than or equal to 0. So if this evaluates as true, the button will now be disabled. And this is another great thing you can do with JSX is, right, I can just take this. This is expecting true or false because it's just HTML, but I can evaluate true or false however I want. So I can pass in this little bit of logic here, and it will just become false or become true thanks to the power of JSX, depending on what the situation is. So if I go back here now, I can see subtract, and I know that I will have the ability to subtract. This is probably a better user experience, but I can't do it right now because I'm at 0. And then when I add, it becomes enabled, and then it becomes disabled. So now we have several layers of protection, right? We can't go below 0 if we actually somehow manage to click this button. And actually, your user can click this button, I think, if they open up this and edit the HTML sneakily, they would have actually been able to get around that. So fortunately, we had that extra layer of security there, and they still can't subtract. This is a good thing to think about on the web because everything is open and exposed, and people will get sneaky sometimes. So if you have a like legitimate security reason why you need somebody to not do that, then you should not be relying on something like just your JSX to protect from that kind of misuse. But anyway, if I reset the page, it should behave like normal. This is just a convenience for our users to know that, hey, this is sometimes an option, but it isn't there currently. How's that making sense to everybody? Cool. So this kind of conditional rendering is a huge part of what I do. It definitely comes up in a lot of applications. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to be changing. Like if you have different kinds of users, maybe an admin user might see a whole bunch of controls at the top that another user wouldn't. Maybe the user sees different branding or white labeling, depending on what, like where they're coming from or what sort of, community they're a part of when they are joining your app. That's something that comes up a lot. There's a number of reasons why you might want to show things or not show things depending on certain things that are in the state, and JSX makes that pretty easy. It can get to be a bit messy. You can sometimes end up with a situation where you have like this one component that can show like 10 different states or something, and you just have line after line of these conditionals, kind of like I put there. And that can get ugly and really hard to follow. So sometimes it's smarter just to break things into separate components, and you have this version of the component you show to this particular type of user, this version of the component you show to the admin user, something like that. It's all up to you. So like in this case, maybe our title is really complicated. and we want to change it up a bunch depending on the user. Or maybe we just want a totally different title if the user is a different kind. And so we can head up to here and just show like admin title versus regular title, depending on if the user is an admin. You have a lot of flexibility here, and most of the work you're going to do, once you get a feel for React and you can get it to show you what you want it to show you and respond to you the way you want to, most of your work becomes that. It becomes a matter of like, how do I organize this in a way that makes sense? How do I take into account these different possible states of the UI in a way that's going to be easy to follow, like as a developer? And how do I organize all this stuff in a way that's clean, that's maintainable? That becomes kind of the next big challenge of development once you're past the whole, like, how do I get it to work phase? And with that, we're just about at 11:30. So I wanted to, I think, stop here and just answer any questions that you all have about React or anything broader than that if you're interested in talking about that. But I hope this was a helpful introduction. I'm hope that it's gets you started on this little segment of your class in a way that's a little bit of maybe a little bit more context on what React does and does well and what it doesn't do well and how you can work around that. But it's it's really fun, exciting way to build UIs. As much as I struggle with it, I do love it and enjoy using it, and I hope you will too.
Quinn, thank you so much. This has been really interesting and exciting and great repetition of some of the cursory stuff we went over yesterday. I just want to kind of follow up again when you were talking about how the challenge becomes trying to determine how to organize your components. And it seems, and I don't know if this is the right terminology to use, but it seems like a component, you end up with lots of nested components. So like a component is made up of components, which may have components in them. And so I think of like a website like Facebook, for example, which I'm assuming uses React, right? And maybe it doesn't, but I'm just to give you an example.
It's a Facebook thing.
Right.
So
yeah.
I hope they use it.
Right. I would hope so. Right. So I'm thinking of like, so is it like, does it make sense then to organize the components like functionally? So let's say I have something that's like a widget on the side, and the widget functionally does something. It might do several different things, but all of those things are like functionally related in this, widget. Then is that like an organizing principle I can use? Like, hey, I'm going to call this thing my widget, and that's like the top level of all these components. And then that widget goes into the app. And then my view, like the final view, ends up being like, 6 different functional widgets or something like that. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just trying to think about, like, it seems like there's a lot of components, and I'm feeling very like unsure about how I would organize like an actual full page of different stuff going on and not feel really lost in the sauce.
It's completely dependent on like the needs of your page. Like this is kind of a Wild West situation where there really are no hard, fast rules on how to do this. One of the reasons why Redux exists and why these bigger frameworks that help you manage like your whole app state exist. Because trying to manage all of the stuff that's going on with just this is not really feasible. And the way Redux works is it's just kind of, you have a single global state and you can't make changes to it. Well, you probably can make changes to it, but the way you, again, much like with the React state, you should make changes in a very specific way. You should pass in the change you want to make, and you get back a new state afterwards, and that updates everything. And you should be very clear about the exact change you're making. So something like you're describing, like a big page with a whole bunch of different moving parts. Maybe there's like a little user profile up on the upper right? And that's like your like user profile widget component. And maybe down here is like, an article that they're reading or something like that. And the way these things would work is you would have that as a single component. Like, this is only concerned with showing user data. It doesn't know about this article and it doesn't care. And it would tie into you can also break up the Redux state into related like sections. which is typically what we do. So you probably would have a user object within the Redux state. You'd have a reducer is what it's called, but like it's basically, here's an object that has all the state about the user. It's got their name, it's got whether they're an admin, it's got their token so that they can, authenticate with the server. It's got various other information. And here's your articles reducer that contains all of the articles they just grabbed from all the latest stuff, right? These two pieces of state are now different, and you would have a single page, your page, and it's like, here's the user widget, here's the article. The user widget, and that's all that page does. That page doesn't even know about state at all. It just knows that these components go on this page. I'm done, I'm out. And then the article component knows, okay, I'm gonna grab the latest articles, I'm gonna show those. It doesn't know about the user. It has no clue what that is. It just knows I'm gonna go into the state, find the articles section of the state, I'm gonna get the 5 most recent articles and I'm gonna show them and then a link to more. And then the user widget doesn't know about articles. It just knows I'm going to go into the state, grab the user bit of the state, show the user's name, their little avatar, maybe an edit button or something that goes to a different page. And so that is how how I would approach something like that. As much as possible, these different widgets are only responsible for their piece of state, and there's as little overlap as possible. So if later I decide, like, you know what, we don't need the user widget on this page, I just delete that user widget from my container page and it's just gone. That was a single line of code I removed. It's no longer there. It still exists in the code and I can use it elsewhere, but it doesn't show up on this page anymore. And then it's like super easy. So now, of course, nothing is ever that simple in real life, but the idea is that the more you let your components focus on one single thing, the better. And if you have to do a lot of complicated mixing, like let's say this article, these articles can only show up if you're an admin because they're drafts, right? That's a common use case. You would probably not even tell the article. You would have that logic in one specific place. Somewhere you're going to have thorny, complicated logic. And the thing that this pattern helps you with is putting that on a very high level that's very separated from the display logic. And then the displays just get what they're told. That this, like that article component, maybe it just knows, okay, I'm getting the 5 most recent articles. It doesn't know that it's only getting the 5 most recent non-draft articles. It has no clue what that means. It just knows, give me the 5 most recent articles, and you have a bit of logic that sits higher up that's like, hey, you're not an admin, you're only going to get these. It doesn't know the difference. It just asks for the articles. So you don't have to make any complicated changes to that. You have all your logic is in one place, really, and it's completely separate from your view logic. And that's generally what you try to do. And again, the real world is complicated and your needs might not be that simple. So it can be hard to separate things that cleanly. But if you go into it with that mindset, it'll generally make for better code and just a better experience for you as you try to build out and maintain what you already have.
Awesome. Thank you, Quinn.
Sure. Any other questions?
I got a quick one. So you're talking about React Native before, and it's mostly for cell phones or something. Are you having to build your application in React Native and React? Like, so you have the web page version and the React Native version or something like that?
No, although there is React Native for the web, which is kind of a weird roundabout thing they did. I don't like started with React. Someone figured out you could use it for mobile devices, and so figured out that it abstracts everything in a way that some people found pleasing to the web. So you can go full circle if you want. But no, what you're doing, it uses React, but it's like a dependency of React Native essentially. So you don't really, you're doing stuff that's very similar to this. It looks almost identical to this. The difference is you don't have actual HTML. You instead have things like view and text and things like that. And those are components that get translated into native components instead of, so it's a little bit more abstracted. Like with React Web, you're seeing a lot of real HTML here, even though it often gets converted into slightly different HTML. Whereas with this, this stuff is getting turned into like UI views and UI text views and all this other stuff that's like built into iOS or Android, and it's cross-platform, so it's meant to be both. But everything else is basically the same, and they try to make the styling as similar as possible. It uses this framework, sort of looks like CSS and has many of the features, and uses Flexbox in a similar way as CSS does. And you are essentially, but once you get down to like, I'm displaying some stuff on screen, I need it to look a certain way. Like it doesn't end up being all that different of an experience. Essentially, and you could theoretically take all of that code and use your React Native Web to turn it into HTML as well, the same way it's translating it into native pages. We haven't really had much of a need to do that though. We sort of have this fantasy that we'll have this magical mono repo for like a site and a app that use all the same components, and like theoretically you could do that, but we just haven't practically needed to do that yet, just because the needs of a desktop experience are generally so different from a mobile app that maintaining that wouldn't make a lot of sense, but it's possible. I don't know if that answers your question.
You did, thanks.
Cool. I see another hand.
Yeah, we haven't covered this yet, but when would we use the use effect hook?
Use effect, yeah. So the use effect hook is kind of like use state. And what use effect does is it's designed for side effects that happen not necessarily on every render. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but basically, yeah, use effect is typically used if it's like, I want something to happen, but only the first time this page renders. Or I want something to happen when this one particular piece of data changes, but not when everything changes. Because right now I could put any bit of logic in here. Like if I want to, let's say that alert thing, for example, right? Like I can just put an alert right in here, you know, hello, I have changed. And this will, every single time that the title re-renders, this is going to fire. So if we go back here, this is going to be super annoying, right? It happens twice in the beginning because for whatever reason it's rendering twice. I'm not totally sure why that is, but that's not uncommon. Now I hit add, that changed the state, that re-renders the component, and it calls this again, twice again. So this is awful. Let's say I want to put up an alert. This isn't great experience, but I want to put up an alert when you try to subtract when you can't, right? Cannot subtract below 0. And we'll take out the disable thing here, so you actually can click the button, right? So now it tells me this every time, which I don't want. I only want that to happen when I hit the subtract button. So, and you know, in this case, oh, that wouldn't even make any sense. We already have a handler here. So what you would really do is you'd put that alert here. But let's say that if it somehow gets below 0, we want to show an alert. Okay, that's a better example. The data has changed into a state we don't want, and we want to show this alert. So I'm just going to let you keep subtracting, but I'm going to yell at you if you go below 0. This is where I would use a use effect hook. So I'm going to use effect, and I'm going to pass in a callback function. This is the effect, I guess, the logic we want to run. And after that callback function, I can pass in a little array. If I pass in an empty array, this will only call once when the component first renders. So we can see it did that. Oh, that's not working, I guess, but it's supposed to work. Okay, well, but now, okay, now it's not doing it when I click on stuff, at least. Yeah, the problem is the entire header is re-rendering, which it shouldn't be doing. But
I have an example up where I load data from an API, change the number, and it pulls a new picture each time. If you'd like to see that, or I could share that with them.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great example. Actually, use effect is often for async things, right? Where it's like I'm waiting on, like, I'm currently in a loading state, but when it stops, you know, being loading, I want to like load, you know, do some action or something like that, or I want to, you know, or I want to refetch data when the user changes this one thing. That would be like the kind of situation where you do that. Do you want to go ahead and share your screen? I can stop.
I can't while you're doing it.
Okay.
So if you guys remember from yesterday's example, where we talked about the set state update, when you're updating a state value that is asynchronous. Remember we had that problem of where we did a console log of that value right after we called the updater. You guys recall this? Where like the value was not updated right away, right? It's an asynchronous update. So that's when use effect comes into play, so that, you know, when we can print out the new value whenever it gets updated. We don't know when that's going to happen. We can react to it when. Sorry, we can react to it when React actually updates the value through its updating mechanism. So that's one use case of use effect, is when you're waiting on something, but you're not quite sure when it's going to happen. So use effect is like, all right, whenever it does happen, we'll kind of move on from there. So you can't just do it synchronously with some of these.
Right.
And we'll be covering use effect later on as well.
Yeah, it's pretty handy. And it's kind of we mentioned some of the old class lifecycle methods back like a long time ago. The React classes had this method called, I think, component will receive props, or like essentially when the props changed, you had a method there that would sort of let you catch that moment and like do something. It was like if you saw a particular thing had changed in a way that you did or didn't want, right? Like you wanted to react to that exact change, but you didn't want to do it on every single render, only when they updated. Use effect has largely replaced that. It's just like, this is something that fires every time. In this case, like that one you're showing there, anytime number changes, the value of number changes, this will fire. If it doesn't change, this won't fire, which is great because you don't want that to constantly hitting the API over and over again. You know, a good example is like some of our pages in an app, we might have have a state that's like it's unloaded, or it's loading, or it loaded, or it's an error. And we want, if you get to a page and the data is unloaded, we want to load the data because it hasn't been stored yet. If it's already loaded though, we don't want to hit it again. We don't want to constantly be refreshing and hitting the API for new data. So that's like a practical example of when we would do it.
Yeah, if I didn't have this here, if I had a blank here, then it would update every single time that and then it would just be in a loop, and it would just constantly over and over and over again.
Yeah, if your result changes your state, which I think in this case it doesn't.
It does, because
it does. That's data. Yeah, it would. Yep. So it's also a way to avoid infinite loops, because yeah, you would fetch the data, set the data, re-render the component, which would then cause it to fetch again, and yeah, it would just endlessly cycle.
Yeah.
And since that's asynchronous and it takes a little bit, it probably wouldn't even catch it. Sometimes React will catch endless loops, but in this case, there'd be enough time there that I think it would just keep doing it. You would see the console logs of everything happening probably, but but that's definitely a common pitfall.
I'll stop sharing now.